Hello everybody, welcome back. Thank you for coming today. Just the standard things again. If you haven't paid a membership, please put £1 in the cup as you walk out the door. Next week we're going to have a social of some sort. We haven't really decided what, so if anybody's got any ideas, tell us at the end. And I'll hand you over now to Dr. Tim Reed.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me. Thanks for coming. So, I'm a medical doctor. My first career was in neuroscience, and trained in psychiatry. And as part of psychiatry, I trained in psychoanalysis. And the reason why I'm saying all this is because having steeped myself in the conventional wisdom about how the brain works and how the psyche is supposed to work, I kind of realised in my mid-30s that although I invested so much time and effort in learning all these things, but it hadn't really taken me an awful long way. There was a whole area of psyche that hadn't been covered by the conventional paradigms. So that's really what I'm going to talk about tonight. And one of the best ways into this area of psyche is, of course, psychedelics. Not the only way, but probably the most accessible way. So psychedelics used to be generally termed as non-specific amplifiers of psychic contents. I'm not sure that's quite right. I think they amplify a more archetypal layer of psyche. So I'm going to start by introducing the concept of archetype and saying a little bit about what that is and how it might be helpful. And I think the best teaching story for me concerning archetype is Plato's cave. This is a story that's 2,500 years old. Plato, of course, was the pupil of Socrates, and he was the teacher of Aristotle. So he was part of that extraordinary lineage of the great Greek philosophers that have shaped our Western philosophy. And the ideas that they were kicking around presumably had been fermenting, germinating for some time. So Plato asks us to imagine a situation where you've got people chained in a fixed position, staring at the back of a cave. Their heads are fixed, they can't move, they've been there since childhood, they know of no other reality. There are two sources of light into the cave. One source is sunlight, which filters very dimly through the tunnel into the cave, just takes the edge off the darkness. The other source of light is from a fire. In front of the fire there's a passageway along which people parade and they show various effigies and they talk among themselves, and the shadows from the effigies are projected onto the back of the cave, which acts as a sort of viewing screen. So the people in their fixed position staring at the back of the cave are looking at these flickering shadows and they're hearing these various sounds. And that stands for consensus reality. That's the consensus reality that, but we are kind of forced to see. Then Plato asks us to imagine two different scenarios. The first scenario is one of the chained people manages to free herself from the chains and walks up the cave, has an encounter with the effigies, has an encounter with the objects. What would they think, Plato asks, if somebody said that these objects are more real than the flickering shadows that they see at the back of the cave? Well, says Plato, they probably wouldn't believe it. They'd be frightened. Their eyes would be dazzled by the increased brightness of the light. They'd be disturbed. They'd be bewildered by the extra dimensions, the extra textures that they're feeling, and they would want to get back to consensus reality. So they would want to leave this extra dimensional existence, and they'd want to get back to consensus reality. The second scenario, the cave dweller, the psychonaut, makes a journey up the cave. Now this is probably going to be a frightening journey. He's going to hit his head, he's going to have an encounter with the shadow, the conditioning, which is represented by the effigies, etc. And he's going to make it out into the outside world. and his eyes are going to be dazzled. It's going to be difficult to see anything, but eventually he starts seeing colours, three-dimensional objects, all the shapes and textures of the extra dimension. And then he'll make out the heavenly bodies, the stars, the moon, and then Plato suggests that he understands that the sun is primary, that everything ultimately comes from the sun. So the heat, the light, consciousness, everything originally comes from the sun. So in Plato's terminology, the sun is the source of everything. In Jungian terminology, that would be the self archetype. So that's at the apex of the pyramid of archetypes from which everything comes. Imagine what it'd be like, Plato asks us, if your psychonaut comes back into the cave again. Is he going to be interested in the flickering shadows, in consensus reality? Is he going to be interested in the games that people play with the flickering shadows, competing with each other as to who's the best at recognising them, the games that people play, rewarding each other, value systems around the flickering shadows? No, he's not, says Plato. And also Plato suggests that his eyes are going to be still somewhat dazzled by the sunlight, the light of the primary consciousness. So he's actually not going to be very good at playing those games anymore. And what's more, if he tries to communicate where he's been, the extra dimensions, the very different range of consciousness where he's been, it's probably not going to make much sense. And if he's not careful, they're going to turn on him. They're going to turn on him. Has to be locked up, like in psychiatry, or something like that. Obviously, Plato didn't use such words. So how does that relate to the psychedelic experience? Well, so psychedelics are probably the most accessible way of turning your gaze away from the flickering shadows at the back of the cave, from turning your gaze away from consensus reality, from making that precarious journey up the passageway of the cave, possibly towards the sunlight. Now, if you can do this journey, it would be great if you had a guide to show you the way. It would be great to have some sort of map of the territory, great to have some people to maybe sit with you, look after you when you come back from your extra dimensional experience. And if you think about psychedelics, I mean, the full-blown psychedelic experience, if you're lucky, you might have a sense of primary consciousness. And I'll be saying a little bit more about that in a moment. There's a form of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy called psychoanalytic psychotherapy, where you take a kind of low to moderate dose. And the idea is that really highlights some of your psychodynamic issues, some of the issues that you need to work on, maybe some of your family issues, the role that's played by your conditioning, etc. So in psychoanalytic psychotherapy, that's going to take you to the area of your conditioning, the effigies, the forms and shapes that really make up your consensus reality. Psychoanalytic psychotherapy will take you into that sort of zone. Microdosing where you take really small dose, let's say 10 to 20 micrograms of LSD, for example. So you wouldn't feel any different. But the idea is that might slightly increase the intensity of the sunlight that's coming into the cave. So, what about the area outside the cave? How can we kind of understand that? There's a story that Ramdas tells. I'll say a little bit more about Ramdas later on, but he started off as Richard Alpert, who was one of the contemporaries of Timothy Leary at Harvard. And he realised that psychedelics opened the doors, and he had some extraordinary experiences, and he had some high-level spiritual experiences after taking psychedelics. What he found very frustrating was that the door kept shutting after the psychedelic experience. So he wanted to find a way of keeping the door open. So as many people did in those days, in the 60s, he went to India. He was trying to find a guru, who would maybe know more about how to stay in that primary reality, how to keep the doors of perception open, so you can stay in that kind of cosmic consciousness, if you like, without coming down again. And he tried really hard to stay high using psychedelics. So there's a story about him and some like-minded friends isolating themselves in a house and taking high-dose LSD every 6 to 8 hours for some days, but they still came down at the end of it. So Ram Dass went to India and he searched high and low for an authentic guru. Found it very frustrating, but eventually he found the guy that he was looking for. And there's a wonderful story he tells about meeting this guy that I won't tell now. But he was taken to see this little old man in the mountains, and he had an experience the night before when he was sitting in the desert. He was thinking about his mother who died the year before. And the little old man in the mountains said to him, you were out in the desert last night, you were thinking about your mother. And Ram Dass had this extraordinary moment of realization that he'd met an authentic guru at last, who had these extraordinary powers, who could see into his thoughts, into his mind, and he radiated this extraordinary compassion. So Ram Dass describes how he was thinking about his less lovable parts, and he could see that the little old man was picking up on his less lovable parts, but still radiated this enormous love and compassion. So after many months of searching, finding inauthentic gurus, it seemed like he'd finally found an authentic guru. So the reason why I'm telling this story is that sometime later, the little old man, who had one called Maharaji, asked to try some of Ram Dass's special medicine. And Ram Dass had his travelling supply of LSD, which was specially made for him, and it was high strength. It's called white lightning, I think, and each time was about 300 micrograms. And he gave him one, and Maharaji, took 3. So he took 9 micrograms of LSD, and nothing happened. Nothing happened. So Ram Dass stayed with him all day, and he seemed completely unaffected by it, which is a bit of a head scratcher. Ram Dass goes back to America, carries on thinking about this. Maybe he didn't actually take it. Maybe there was some sleight of hand. So a couple of years later, he repeated the experiment, and Maharaji once again took this very high dose of acid, and nothing happened. So the explanation for this that Ram Dass came up with was that Maharaji basically lived in the land outside Plato's cave. So he lived in this realm of extraordinary consciousness, which supports the idea really that LSD and psychedelics don't actually change reality. They open a sort of gateway, so that if you have the cognitive structures to get there, will take you into a deeper version of reality. The story about Maharaji seems to support that. So as Ram Dass said, if you live in Chicago, you don't need to take a train to Chicago. So what about this light? What about this bright light? The experience of cosmic consciousness that you can get with psychedelics. I mean, you don't have to take psychedelics to get this experience. It can happen spontaneously. It would seem that taking psychedelics is one of the easiest ways of getting there. So I'm going to move on now to Stanislav Grof. How many of you have heard of Stanislav Grof? Okay, so he's 85 now. He was born in the Czech Republic, And he got very interested in Freud and wanted to be a psychoanalyst. And started training as a psychoanalyst in his early 20s and went to medical school because that's what he had to do in those days. And he was finding his psychoanalytic training increasingly boring and frustrating. As he points out, it's very long treatments with uncertain results. And then in the 1950s, Sandoz, the pharmaceutical company that manufactured LSD, was sending LSD out to academic departments, departments of psychiatry around the world, basically saying we got this extraordinary substance. We're not sure what its use is. Please use it as you see fit. And Grof had his first LSD session as part of a scientific experiment. I think he was given 200 micrograms. And about an hour into the session, someone came up to him with a strobe. And the idea was that you turn on the strobe and you measure his brainwave, so he was all wired up. And he reports that when the strobe came on, his senses magnified the experience, so he had this extraordinary experience of bright light. And he likened it at the time to what it must be like being at the centre of Hiroshima. What he says now is that it's more like Dharmakaya, which is the Hindu Buddhist term for the primary light of consciousness. So this extraordinary white light that totally blew away his ego structures. So he completely lost sense of who he was, where he was. Felt like he was catapulted out into space. And then he describes as though he was out in deeper space, and there were lots of astronomical events. And he was very clear that his consciousness left his body. Eventually the strobe was turned off. As the strobe was turned off, his consciousness constricted again, and he slowly returned to Prague and to Rome, and he describes how his consciousness was still separate from his body, and it took a little bit of adjusting before he could get it back into his body again. So that was a life-changing event for Grof, and he realised that the psychoanalysis he'd been studying was really narrow and limited compared to what he'd experienced. It was a limited paradigm of which he no longer had interest. He decided to devote the rest of his life to the study of non-ordinary states of consciousness, which is what he's done. I'll say a little bit more about Grof later on. I'm going to tell a story now about John Huston Smith, who was a religious scholar in the States in the 50s, 60s and 70s. He wrote a very famous book about comparative religion. He was one of the first people, I think, to kind of popularise comparative religion in the West in those days. And he was very interested in Zen. He was interested in ecstatic experiences, and he wanted to have an experience of the deeper layers of consciousness. And he thought Zen was the way to do it. And he studied Zen hard for 10 years. So he meditated, as in the Zen way for 10 years. He went to a Zen monastery, and he gave it his best shot. At the end of 10 years, he felt he hadn't really got anywhere. Made a little bit of progress, but he hadn't got anywhere near the sort of layers of consciousness that he wanted to access. And then when he was 41 in the early 60s, I say 41 because it kind of seems that it's often in midlife when people seem to have these extraordinary experiences. I'm not sure why that is. You might not agree with me. It might just be in midlife, but better at writing it down and describing it. And then he took psilocybin. And he describes going up through the layers of consciousness that he was familiar with through his studies in comparative religion. And he felt he was approaching divine consciousness. He had a very strong feeling that if he took that final step and merged with divine consciousness, which I suppose which is represented by Plato's sun archetype, he had a very strong feeling that he would die. His sitter was Timothy Leary, and just at that stage, Timothy Leary came into the room and asked him how he was doing, and he said, "I'm considering taking that final step that will cause my physical body to be no more." And he felt that very very strongly. And he compared it later to a feeling of if you're a toaster, plugging your toaster into a power line. Okay, so he survived. There's a common theme with these high-level experiences that you think you're going to die, but you don't. So what Huston Smith gathered from that was that by taking a psychedelic, he'd got to a zone in just a few hours that he'd been trying to get to for about 10 years by conventional means. He wrote about this experience, and this generated quite a lot of controversy about the relationship between psychedelic states and spiritual experience. There are basically three camps. There's one camp that held that if you can access this sort of experience by taking a chemical, this means that all spiritual and mystical experiences are ultimately reducible to chemical interactions. We can understand them in a biochemical way to do with brain structure. The other way of looking at it is that psychedelics induce genuine spiritual experiences, same as saints have. Another way of looking at it is that psychedelics induce spiritual experiences which are not really authentic. They're like pseudo-spiritual experiences. So what Huston Smith did was he did a bit of research to see if there was any difference between sort of mystical experiences that people have on psychedelics and sort of mystical experiences that saints have. And he essentially found out that there was no difference between experiences, that independent observers could not tell the difference between the reports of the saints and the mystics and the reports of psychedelic-induced spiritual experiences. So the conclusion he drew from that was similar to the conclusion that Ramdas drew from Maharaji's experience, that the psychedelics don't just create an altered sense of reality, but in certain circumstances they can take you deeper to another layer of reality. Which, if you think about it, is kind of in tune with quantum physics. It's not something that quantum physicists talk about very much, but we know that the everyday physical reality that we see is just a construct mediated by our cognitive structures and our sensory apparatuses. So these solid things, I mean, at a fundamental level, they're not really solid. Solid things. People we see is basically a web of interconnected vibrating energy. These are the insights that quantum physicists tell us. So that kind of helps us to understand really just how much our ordinary everyday reality is so completely mediated by our cognitive apparatus and our sensory systems and our conditioning. I think about 5 or 6, and he was very interested in spiritual experience. I mean, this was what he really wanted. So, and I think often when you've had an experience like this, you want more. It's very, very tantalising. Having touched that zone, that primary energy is so ecstatic, so kind of blissful, so loving that's really what you want. And then he says that after 5 or 6 sessions, he got bombers. So he got bad trip after bad trip, and he felt there was no value in the bad trips. He obviously thought about it, but he felt there was no value in the bad trips. So he took Alan Watts's message, which was if you got the message, hang up the phone. So he hung up the phone. Decided not to take psychedelics anymore. So that really brings us on to the area of bad trips. So I've got nothing to do with slides. So what my feeling about Huston Smith was that the bad trips were probably trying to get him to pay attention to something quite important that was coming up in his psyche. But he wasn't receptive to that at that point in time. So what he thought was a valueless bummer, maybe with a different attitude, maybe with a little bit more support or whatever, or a more conducive mindset, maybe there was something that could have been usefully got from those bad trips. Maybe there were some areas of his psyche, some barriers, some resistances that he actually needed to get through. In order to make further progress on his journey. And this really brings us to the heart of the psychedelic journey, the transpersonal journey, the hero's journey, the journey towards growth, if you like. That it's not all the bright lights, and you probably do need to do some work on your shadow, your difficult areas. But the difficulty is that in a psychedelic session, your problematic areas of psyche are going to have an archetypal intensity. So the meaning is really going to be ramped up. It's really going to be amplified. So it is going to be difficult. But I would suggest that if you're on a kind of growth path, that this is something that you maybe need to be aware of. You maybe need to be up for. I'm not sure about that. I'm not sufficient an expert in psychedelic medicine to be sure about this, but I was asking Grof about this in the summer, and he suggested there were some circumstances where that might not be the case. So the material that would be described as a bad trip in an uncontrolled setting is exactly what is wanted in a more therapeutic environment. It's a wonderful tool to really enable you to get hold of what needs to be worked on. So as a psychiatrist and psychoanalytical psychotherapist, I'm really interested in this, because psychoanalytical psychotherapy, you can work with people for years, and some defences you can work with, you can get around. Some defences really difficult to permeate. Some personality structures really difficult to work with. The bottom line is that psychotherapy is slow, difficult work, and it has uncertain results. So the question is, how can you really help people to shift what they what they want to shift. I'm going to say some more about that shortly. But I want to go on to Albert Hofmann now, who I'm sure you've all heard of. He was the chemist who first synthesised LSD, and he had this iconic bike ride after taking a dose of 250 micrograms, which he thought was was a microdose, and was probably not going to have any effect on him. Whereas in fact it was a perfectly judged dose, which he took by accident to give him a full-blown psychedelic experience. So he wobbled home. Well, he didn't wobble home on his bike. He flew back on his bike. And the assistant who was with him, it indicated that he was going at some speed. Now, he was a pioneer. He had no one to tell him that there was no one to show him the way. Really, he didn't know what he'd taken. He describes how when he got back to his flat, the furniture, his surroundings were taking on a threatening hue. He thought he was dying. He asked for milk because it was a non-specific antidote. It's kind of interesting that there was a part of his brain that was working sufficiently well to realise that milk was a non-specific antidote. So he asked for milk, and he asked for a doctor. The milk came from his neighbour, who was a kindly woman. But in his state, he was full of dread and fear, and he saw her as a malevolent, witch-like figure. So he was getting in touch with some deeply distressing material from himself. He was projecting it on to his external environment, which is one of the things that happens in psychedelic experiences. He was having a really horrible time. He thought he was going to die. At one point he stood up and screamed. He was racked with guilt. He had thoughts about his family. His wife and children were away in another town, and he thought he'd done a terrible thing to them by poisoning himself. He thought he'd done a terrible thing. His life was meaningless because he was going to die. All his research, all the things that he held dear, were just going to crumble into dust. Really, really horrible. The ultimate badge. I mean, how many people here have experienced something of that nature? Really had the horrors. Yeah. So what happened then? The doctor arrived, and the doctor checked him over, and his pupils were dilated, but apart from that, he seemed okay. And the doctor basically just sat with him. At this stage, Hoffman wasn't able to articulate a coherent sentence to say what he'd done with his assistants to do that. So the doctor just sat with him. The doctor was the world's first sitter. You won't get this in the NHS, by the way. And so his setting was safe. And I think because the setting changed, he felt looked after. He had the necessary reassurance. And it settled. The dread-filled experience left him. He started to enjoy the play of the colours, the way in which sounds turned into colours, and he started enjoying the experience. And then the next day he felt great. A sensation of new life and well-being flowed through me. Breakfast tasted delicious and gave me extraordinary pleasure. I walked into the garden where the sun shone after a spring rain. Everything glistened as if newly created. So he had the kind of the classical psychedelic experience, if you like, in one go. He had a very challenging experience. Thought he was going to die. He was kind of held through that. He was supported through that. It softened, and he was reborn in some way. He felt more alive than he had before. And that feeling stayed with him all day. So that's something that you're kind of looking for with this sort of work. You're looking for, I'll say a little bit more about this later, looking for what's called ego death, where often redundant parts of ego become dissolved, if you like, in the psychedelic experience. Because the power of a psychedelic can chisel away at some of the bits of ego that would otherwise be resistant to change. And then, if all goes according to plan, the ego reforms in a different sort of relationship with the self archetype, so it's illumined by Plato's sun. Doesn't usually last. It's not a one-off. So, in the process of psychedelic psychotherapy or working in non-ordinary states, it's usually a process that needs repeating time and time again. The constant process of working on yourself, of using the tools to overcome your resistance to help you down the path that you need to go successive ego death, reshaping of ego, and incorporating a closer relationship with the archetypal self. Coming back to Grof again, so he took this quite a lot further. After this experience, he started working in psychedelic research and clinical work with LSD and other drugs in Prague. And he started off working a bit like a psychoanalyst, so he would sit at the end of the couch and someone would take a psychedelic, and then he realised that really just didn't work, and the material that people were telling him had very little to do with what he'd learned about in psychoanalysis. So this led to modifications, such as the introduction of music, the use of body work when people seem to get stuck with physical sensations in their body. He accumulated an enormous amount of experience, and I think by the time he left for the States in the mid-60s, he'd sat for about 2,500 sessions. And the model they used in Prague was that you develop you develop a very careful relationship with the person who's about to take psychedelic. So they'd be brought into the unit, there'd be, a full history would be taken, build up a therapeutic relationship with the people who'd be sitting with them for their session, and then they'd be kept under constant supervision for at least 24 hours afterwards. The sessions would be spaced a week or two apart. There'd be ongoing psychotherapy in between the sessions, and people would generally need about 15 to 20 sessions. Now, Grof himself then had another personal session that he feels greatly advances understanding of challenging psychedelic experiences. And he took about 300 micrograms. He was alone at home, and he found himself getting into a state of horrible meaninglessness. And again, it was just a horrible, horrible state, and everything felt dry and arid and pointless and meaningless, and life has no meaning, the cosmos has no meaning. He was trying to work his way out of it, and he describes how thinking that that knowledge is good, so knowledge has meaning. And then he was thinking, well, he could spend the rest of his life studying things in libraries, but then he'd be an old man who couldn't remember what he had for breakfast. And then how about investing children, family life with meaning? But then he thought, well, but then you're just bringing your children into a meaningless world, and it's an act of cruelty for them. So, I mean, it's really quite difficult to describe the magnitude of these horrible states. You have to be quite strong to endure them. And then he realised that, and he described it as a state of constriction, of suffocation. And then he realised that he was having some physical sensations. Felt as though his head was being crushed, couldn't breathe, his body was being crushed, felt as though he couldn't escape. And then he had the insight that this was like the process of being born. So it was like he was back in the womb, trying to get out, and he couldn't. He was stuck. So this led to one of his extraordinary insights, I think, which is really that the start of our individual psyche goes back beyond infancy. So according to psychoanalysis, we're born as a blank slate, and then our personality starts forming in relationship with mother, breastfeeding, etc. And that's how our personality structures, our emotional structures start developing. And what Grof suggests is that it starts much earlier than that, and we have an intrauterine consciousness. And then, of course, there's the extraordinary journey of being born. Extraordinary journey of being born. And he divides that journey into four stages. The first stage is when you're developing baby and you're all snug and comfortable in the womb, and everything is just fine. Second stage there is when labour starts, the uterus starts contracting, and your world is shaken up in a really pretty horrible way, and there's no escape. No escape at all, no hope. Everything is futile. The third part of it is when the cervix starts opening, and the baby can start to see some light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak, and embarks on this extraordinary life and death journey towards the outside world. It's a real battle to get out. And then you've got the fourth stage, which is the delivery. The sense of freedom and relief, escape, birth into another world. So that's the first stage. The second stage, that's pretty unhappy chicken there. So what's this got to do with psychedelics? Well, it seems that this is a really important part of the psyche that maybe we need to process in order to make the journey that we want to do. And it's part of the psyche that we can often get really stuck with. So in conventional psychotherapy, I think there are parts of the psyche that conventional psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, just hit. The insight that Grof had after his experience was that in some way in his adult life, he kind of stayed with that stuck, entrapped baby. So he sort of says that he realised that he was always in so much of a hurry to move on to the next thing that he couldn't really enjoy life, couldn't really appreciate. He couldn't really appreciate the wonder that was life. And he said that having had this psychedelic experience, feeling so constricted, so trapped, so hopeless, and emerging from that and making sense of it, helped him to birth himself in a way, helped him to move on to a stage where he no longer felt fundamentally stuck in that place of entrapment, and he could live in a fresher way. He could appreciate what's going on around him. And this is a layer of psyche that you tend to come across over and over again in psychedelic states, and it's really helpful to have a bit of a map of territory. It's also quite extraordinary. It also helps to explain how it is that so often you emerge from the state of horrible entrapness and despair and existential futility, and you emerge from that to that very beautiful, freshly born look. Basically, you're moving along the archetype of the prenatal process. So I've just got a few more pictures here that illustrate this in a slightly different way. So that's the first stage of the perinatal schema, if you like, taken to an archetypal level, a sort of cosmic consciousness of being in the womb. I'm just going to go through these. I don't really say very much. So these pictures are drawn by people who've had psychedelic sessions or holotropic breathwork sessions. Things get a bit more menacing here, isn't it? This is more of a potential toxic womb experience. So the baby is blissfully unaware of it. So that's a bad trip, isn't it? That's a toxic womb where you feel that you're being assaulted and assailed, and the world's become very threatening and dangerous and horrible and toxic and so the idea is that if you can fully experience these states, in a non-ordinary state of consciousness, whether psychedelic or using some other method, you're really working something through, you're processing something, you're resolving something on a very deep layer of the psyche. So it's worth doing, it's worth doing. I mean, it looks horrible, doesn't it? You wouldn't want to go there. But I would encourage you to not quail from it. I'd be hopeless in noticing. So this is the constriction of that second stage of labour. There's no escape. And often this sort of material can develop into archetypal themes, like good and evil, and saints and demons, and the devil, and stuff like that. I mean, in literature, I think one of the most wonderful representations of this state is Tolstoy's The Death of Ivan Ilyich. Has anyone read? Anyone familiar with it? What do you think of it?
I've never made this connection with what you say. Yeah. I'm going to think about it more.
Well, it's about a Russian man who's dying, and he really describes the existential fear and the fear and loathing and the sense of futility, and how everything that he used to value is like sawdust. Has the things that he used to yearn for, material things, all kind of falling away. But then, right at the end of the book, right at the end of the story, it's a wonderful sense of deliverance and moving towards the light, which really kind of mirrors Groff's perinatal sequence in a way. So we're moving on here to the third stage of the perinatal sequence, which is the move through the birth canal from the state of hopeless constriction to the next stage. But it's a very threatening journey, and often people will have images of archetypal figures, and this is a representation of one of these sort of very frightening images. That's what it's like being born. Ego, death and rebirth, like the rebirth itself, hurts, stings a bit. So now we're moving into the culmination of the process. Sense that you've moved through something, connection with the cosmos, in often a new and fulfilling way. You often find that people, become much more interested in ecological ideas, and if they haven't necessarily been interested, a much greater sense of connection, compassion, and it is essentially a spiritual journey, also a spiritual tale. And, I'm not talking about religion here, it's got nothing to do with religion, which is more to do with hierarchy and social structures. Go into the psyche, you can go into this area of psyche and stay with it, and you're adequately supported. It is essentially a spiritual journey. How can I do
we have to room till
if anyone's got any questions or anything while I'm going on, please feel free to.
So can you just talk about who painted all those pictures? Are they all Grof?
These are Grof slides, and they're pictures that he's collected over the years from people mostly doing holotropic breathwork, which I will say now.
I mean, a few times you mentioned being supported by a guide or someone, like a physical person. But whenever I've had psychedelic experiences, there's always been either the mushroom or something else that guides me anyway.
Yeah.
And it feels like there's this benevolent force that knows what to do anyway.
Yeah.
So, I don't know, what do you think people need a guide?
I think usually people do, but you know what you're describing is entirely valid. I think everyone needs to find their own way. If you find a way that you're happy working with, and you know you've got your relationship with mushroom, and you feel held and supported. I mean, it sounds like you're quite experienced, and you found a setting that suits you. What I would say is that it's important to have the right setting. To have a supportive setting. Now, for most people, so certainly in holotropic breathwork, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, you would always have your experience with a sitter. In a psychedelic session, you would mostly be recommended to have a sitter just in case you come to one of these really difficult areas and you need some help. That doesn't mean that you need to have a sitter.
Yeah, because isn't that the most? But if you can deal with that really difficult thing yourself,
yeah,
then you've solved it. Right?
I mean, in psychedelic psychotherapy, or in more sort of formal sessions, the recommendation is always going to be to have a sitter. But if people are experienced and they know what they're doing and they find a setting that they're familiar with, then that's fine. How many people have heard of holotropic breathwork? Okay. So when Grof went to the States in the 60s, this was in the closing days of the era of clinical and research work with psychedelics, and then it all got closed down in the context of the protest movement, Vietnam War, what people saw as a resource for use, etc., etc. So essentially, Grof with his wife Christine, who was a yoga teacher, developed a non-drug way of helping you to access the same sort of territory. It's called holotropic breathwork, and basically you hyperventilate to induce the non-ordinary state. You lie on a mat, you have a sitter with you, music is played very loud, certain type of music, archetypally evocative music, has a certain structure to it, so we'll start off being quite intense, and then we'll soften, we'll often have a spiritual tone. What I think works particularly well about holotropic breathwork is the attention paid to integration. So it's a very secure setting, you're very held within the retreat setting, and the whole process is geared towards integration. What do we mean by integration? Well, it's a method of bringing back the contents of your experience into consciousness, so that it can be of some use. So if you have a high dose LSD session, it will often dissolve your ego to such an extent that it's quite difficult to bring it back home to make sense of it. Holotropic breathwork is relatively low dose, so it's been compared to a low to moderate dose of psilocybin. I think the advantages of that are that people's psychological defences are respected. So if you've got some issues, and some people do have issues which can be quite, which need careful handling, people can approach it cautiously. So you can modulate the intensity of your experience, at least to some extent. I think holotropic breathwork is best done in a retreat setting, usually about five days or so. There's a gradual increase of intensity with the opening circle, often meditation practices, etc., which helps to activate the psyche. If someone's, and then in a retreat setting like that, often people will have two breathwork sessions. If someone's new to it, they'd often be quite cautious in the first session, just to satisfy themselves that it's safe. And then the second session, can really access what they need to access. The integration is complicated. Lots of drawing, some talking. We often find that the contents of a psychedelic session are quite difficult to articulate, often quite difficult to put into words. So often other practices like drawing or making mandalas, there's a whole load of practices, which are useful, and then some sharing circles as well. So I think what holotropic breathwork is really good at is making the best of the psychedelic experience. I'm not saying that I'm not saying that holotropic breathwork is the only way. It has the advantage of being legal. So I can recommend holotropic breathwork to people. I can work with holotropic breathwork in a way that you can't do at the moment easily with psychedelics. I know some people do try and do this sort of work with underground psychedelic workshops, and some people do great work with that. I think there is a difficulty with the integration. And holotropic breathwork. When I was doing the training, which I finished back like 10 years ago or so, I would go and retreat about twice a year. So I would find that the experience I had in a holotropic breathwork retreat would really give me enough to work on probably for about 6 months. I did that for 4 years, but I think it probably takes that sort of time. It probably takes that sort of time to go through some sort of process. And of course, having finished it, the journey's not ended. You find that ego keeps growing back, all these ego traps that you're always working with. So the journey, of course, goes on. And I think this is a really useful way of doing the journey. So I'm going to finish my talk by telling you about someone who I worked with in a holotropic breathwork retreat last year, and who then went on to have some psychedelic sessions with Liberty Cap mushrooms. So he came to, we'll call him Sam, and he came to his first holotropic breathwork retreat. And he's a solid guy, works as an engineer, probably mid-40s. And he'd had a sense of some sort of opening, which had started when he went to the Boom Festival, the year or so before. And it was something that he really wanted to work on. He was aware that as he was opening, it had a kind of spiritual component, but he was aware that it was activating some parts of his psyche that were quite difficult for him. So he wanted to take it further, but he was also aware that it might be a slightly dangerous issue for him. And he told me that his mother apparently had LSD when he was younger. She said she was spiked, and she ended up in a psychiatric hospital for a few months. And he described to me what it was like growing up with a mother who had some psychological difficulties, and he didn't want to go there. So his first breathwork session, he was quite cautious, and he felt his way gradually into it. And he said it was a nice experience, and he got some insight into some of his issues and felt a bit loved up, as people often do. In his second session, he seemed to go a little deeper, and he started coming out of it. Yeah, when people finish their breathwork session after about 3 hours, you get checked out by one of the facilitators just to make sure that everything is as it should be, and not holding anything in your psyche or your body that is causing you, that needs further work. Really important that people finish, that people properly finish. And Sam said he had a tightness in his chest that was really uncomfortable for him, and it felt very familiar for him, and it was very emotionally loaded. So I asked him if he wanted to do some work on it, and he said he did. So what we do in holotropic breathwork is if people have something like that, you ask them to intensify it. You ask them to breathe into it and make it bigger. So I said, Sam, would you like to do some work on this? Yes. So lie down your mat, take some more deep breaths, try and make it bigger, and then I'm going to apply some pressure, and you if you want, you can we'll see what happens. And then he starts pushing against my hands. So in breathwork and in psychotherapy, you not uncommonly find yourself in a situation where people are holding something in their body, and you need to work with it in a physical way. You're never doing anything. You're just applying some resistance for people to do their own work. So he was pushing against my hand. That seemed to help a little bit, but it was still there. Sam should go a little bit deeper. So so we go through the process again. I get a cushion, put more weight in his chest. He pushes. So and then we concluded that, and he felt as though a huge release had occurred, and he said this was a feeling of pressure that he'd been carrying out with him for as long as he remember, and it had something to do with wanting people in his family to be okay. So he's someone who takes emotional responsibility for him, often to the detriment of his own needs. So it seemed to have a lot to do with that. He felt great afterwards. Really felt as though something had really fundamentally shifted, and it stayed that way the next day. It wasn't anything I was doing. This is something that all facilitators get trained to do. It's not something that I'm doing. I'm just providing the tools for him to do his own work. Okay, so move forward a few months, and I have an email from Sam, who tells me that he needs to talk, and he felt that he wanted to accelerate this process, and he took a large dose of psilocybin, and he sat for himself like you. He felt he felt that he was doing the process, knew what he was doing, had a long experience of practice with psilocybin. His wife was in the same house. She wasn't sitting for him, and he felt that, and he hadn't experienced himself as a warrior. Big, powerful warrior who was in battle, was screaming and roaring and doing what warriors do, like a berserker Viking. And he was in battle, and it ended up with his head being cut off. He experienced, his head coming off, and he was full of rage and hate and anger, and really sort of charged up. And then his head was cut off. He died, and he went to a place of extraordinary sort of peace and love and compassion, and all the difficult feelings sort of fell right away, and it had an extraordinary intense spiritual quality to it. So it got to a place of great love and compassion, the sort of place that the mystics talk about. The problem was that having come down from that, he found it very difficult to function in the everyday world. He felt exquisitely thin-skinned, couldn't go to work. His mood sort of alternated between feelings of being loved up and compassionate and feeling it had a very valuable experience, to being very emotionally labile, tearful, and irritable. Phil said he downloaded a huge amount of energy. He couldn't sleep at night. His body was highly activated. So to cut a long story short, he needed 3 months off work. We Skyped weekly. So I suppose I was kind of sitting for him, helping him to integrate what he was going through. His energy levels gradually subsided, his difficult energies gradually subsided over the course of about a month. So he could sleep again. He gradually became less thin-skinned. A huge amount of emotional material came out to do with his family of origin, his wife. He went for some long walks in the Lake District. He was having sort of visions, emotional material that he found was difficult to understand. Did lots of drawing, helped him to understand it more. He stopped drinking, started going to a Buddhist organisation once a week, started a daily meditation practice. Everything gradually settled. Everything gradually settled down. But he felt that he needed more. Fast forward to this summer, went to the Boom Festival again, came back, did some more mushrooms. When I say did some more mushrooms, they're a highly ritualised setting. So he meditates beforehand, he prepares himself in a certain way, frankincense, and essentially the same sequence sort of happened again, except instead of one death experience, he had multiple death experiences. Experiences of him being killed as though it was past lives, and then it was frightening and difficult for him. And then this extraordinary sense of ascension, to a higher, higher place, and peace and love and compassion, etc., etc. But this time he was able to integrate it, and he was okay afterwards, able to carry on going to work. Had an extraordinary sense that he'd been able to bring this transcendent state back with him in a way that he wanted to make use of. And then a few weeks later, he did the same again and had another similar experience. And the last contact I had with him was that he felt he'd come to the end of the cycle. So, what do you make of this sort of experience? I mean, some people would take it literally and think that you are literally accessing past lives, and that these are lives that you have lived. So some people do think that. Other people, probably the majority, would see it on a more symbolic level. And some people, and I'd probably count myself in this, would say it's a bit more complicated than that. It might well be a bit of both and more as well. From a symbolic perspective, I think it illustrates very nicely the theme of death rebirth that you go through on this kind of psychedelic journey. The process of chipping away at redundant bits of ego that maybe you don't need anymore. The structures that grow up over the years, and are difficult to work with. I'm looking around you all. Of course, you're all you're young. Your egos are developing. So in many ways, this may not apply to you. But when 10 years time, 20 years time, your egos become a little bit more solid, and some problematic areas that may be difficult to do something about. So I think the experiences that Sam was describing are very much to do with the archetypal ego death rebirth experience, and I think that's something that we're all kind of doing. I mean, his is a very vivid example of that. So that's all I've got to say. If you want, I can show you this YouTube clip, which is about 7 minutes long. Depends how we're doing for time. Yeah. So this clip, if we can get it going, is about the use of psychedelics for end-of-life anxiety. It's a therapy for end-of-life anxiety, which is one of the ways in which it might be very useful to use it in a therapeutic way.
People in this country don't talk about death. When I would talk about it, sometimes with people, they would go, "Oh, be optimistic. Don't talk that way. You're going to be fine." And you really need to look at it. And this is the perfect way to do it. Once you have an illness diagnosed that's terminal, it really changes your viewpoint.
Specifically with the cancer study, we're administering psilocybin as a treatment for serious mental suffering. Certainly, individuals with advanced cancer often have significant levels of existential anxiety.
I had lost my faith because of anxiety, and I was just terrified. I was so anxious that it was hard to think about anything else. I didn't think I was so worried about death, but I was worried about the process of dying, about suffering and being in pain and having all kinds of horrible medical procedures. I was being irritable with my husband, Richard, when I was so anxious, and that was a very bad thing, because he's my caretaker, when I'm ill, and I was not being nice to him and treating him the way I should at all.
She was irritable and we were both stressed out. I'm not saying it was her fault. The dynamic of the interaction between us often led to quarreling.
We talked about my intention, and my intention was to learn to control my anxiety so I could enjoy the rest of my life, because I was not enjoying my life. at all.
I'm there with the subject for the entire 6 hours. We take a standard hospital room, and my research coordinator fixes it up with wall hangings and fabric, so we really create a nice setting, and patients are kind of cocooned.
Lovely purple wall hangings, and they brought orchids. I was thrilled with that. And then I had one of my tankas, my favorite tanka, right at the foot of my bed.
And I advise them to go as deeply as possible into the experience.
As soon as it started working, I knew I had nothing to be afraid of, because it connected me with the universe. It was very gentle, and there were people right there if I got upset. Everything looked absolutely beautiful. I didn't see things that weren't there. With my eyes covered, I saw patterns and visions and seen faces and things. I thought about being involved with people I love, and I thought about things I would do in front of them and things I would tell them. I had an amazing spiritual experience, so it reconnected me to the universe. One of the CDs I brought, which was the Kyoto monks. On psilocybin, I just felt like I was with these monks, and they were giving me teachings and teaching me how to relax my body and to have faith. I was lying on this hospital bed, and it felt like the bed had turned into a circle of hands that were holding me up. And I was being supported. A Christian person would probably experience being supported by Jesus or God. They put on Ave Maria, and for some reason, that made me cry about what effect my death is going to have on my granddaughter. And they all came over and they just sort of put their hands on top of my hands. They didn't say anything, but they were just there. And it was very comforting.
Every hour, we check in, see how they're doing.
I had to get up and go to the bathroom, and when I was washing my hands, I looked in the mirror. I used to have very long curly hair, and people thought I was so much younger than I was, and now I look my age, but, at least. So I went back into the room and talked to them about that. I sort of came to the conclusion that, well, yes, I look older, but with age comes wisdom and maturity, and I felt okay with it.
When we came back, it was like someone had put on a light bulb inside of Annie's head. She was literally glowing.
Also, for our cancer study, we're looking at the impact of our treatment on their overall quality of life.
After that session, Richard and I went to Hawaii, and we had a lovely time. It wasn't weighing on my mind. I started chemo again, and it went okay.
I mean, like everybody else, Annie has good days and bad days. And some days, you're in pain, you're nauseous, whatever it is from the treatment. It's not easy, and I really do believe that the psilocybin has continued to buoy up her spirits.
I want to spend more time with the people who are important in my life, and my relationship with my mother improved because I finally told her. She was very anti-drug, and I played a radio show that I was on for her, and we have gotten so much closer since I opened up that part of my life to her. I don't look ahead as far. This time of year I would be ordering plants for the spring to put in my garden, but I'm much more focused on this moment right now. What we did, it probably would have taken me years of therapy. And I would recommend psilocybin treatment for anyone with a terminal or potentially terminal illness. It's incredibly helpful. It's more helpful than any other treatment I've ever had.
Thank you very much.